sexual violence is, oh good. Yeah, campus sexual violence is a bit of a niche topic, even within the larger world of sexual violence. So whenever I'm invited to talk about this issue, I'm always really excited because the way that things are right now is students are mostly navigating violence that they experience on their own. They don't have a lot of support from their communities. They don't have a lot of support from their institutions. And it really is other people showing up, learning about this issue proactively that's going to change that. So yeah, I am Lorraine Holmes. I'm the crisis counseling facilitator at BAWAR, where I actually facilitate right now a support group for survivors of campus violence. I also bring experience as a confidential advocate on a college campus, a local public university. I was there for just over a year. And in addition to my professional experience, I also am a survivor whose experience of higher education was profoundly impacted by the violence I experienced and also the lack of support that I had after. So while I'm really passionate about supporting survivors, showing up for survivors, this is what I do all day, every day. Yeah, much of the population, this issue is really taboo. And it's almost this feeling like if you talk about it, it makes it real. So I'm really trying to shift that, right? Because talking about it is the only way that we're going to bring understanding to these issues, take the fear, take the stigma, take the shame away. And yeah, definitely I would say with Title IX and campus sexual violence too, it is also highly politicized in ways that other experiences of violence aren't. I think often campuses become these cultural war grounds where we believe, they're symbolic of things that are wrong in our society. A lot of fear of youth sexuality is represented in how older people talk about what's happening on college campuses. And so I'm hoping to get through some of that misinformation. I'm hoping to bring as much nuance as possible to this really complex issue. And I'm also hoping to highlight the lived experience, what it's like for people who are trying to exist at this intersection of being a student and being someone who has experienced violence. And so before we get started, I do just want to do a little Zoom housekeeping. So the informational section, this part is recorded. The Q&A will not be recorded, but that being said, if you have a question that you feel comfortable sharing, I would love to answer that live so everyone can benefit. Cameras are optional, but encouraged, and we definitely want to welcome lively participation. You can feel free to unmute yourself and talk, or you can type in the chat. And I like to read the chats aloud and continue the conversation that way. But if you would prefer that I don't read the chat aloud so it doesn't show up in the recording, just put a couple asterisks before your chat and I won't read that on camera. Any questions about those guidelines or any clarification needed before I move on?
Lorraine, could you possibly repeat just the last bit about the recording and the participation? Because we had a couple of people join right now and I would just like for them to know again. So sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So right now we are recording the informational part of this presentation, but we will turn the recording off when we get to Q&A. So if you have something that you feel more comfortable asking without being recorded, you'll have space and you can save it. But if there is anything that you want to participate with, and we really want to encourage lively participation, like I said, this is a discussion. Yeah, you can either unmute yourself and share, or feel free to type in the chat, and I will read those chats out loud. But if you would prefer that I don't, just put a couple asterisks in front of your chat, and I'll just know to keep that in the chat, and I won't read that on camera.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And can I just get thumbs up if that sounds okay to everybody? Awesome. Thank you. Great. Okay. And so the other thing I want to talk about before we get started is this can be a difficult topic, right? And so I really want you to feel empowered to take care of your own needs. You need some water, you need a break, you need to leave this presentation altogether. I want you to be able to do that and don't feel like you're being rude because yeah, this is hard, and especially if you're not used to hearing survivor stories. Hearing these things is hard. It's actually traumatizing to hear trauma stories. So if you don't have a practice of self-care, make sure that you're doing something after the presentation to shake it off, take care of yourself, because yeah, that impact can be real. And we also want to honor the various paths that people have taken to arrive here. Everybody has their own experience, everybody has their own background, everyone has their own relationship with sexual violence, with higher education. So this is a really complicated topic, and definitely, every path to get to this presentation today is valid, and we honor that. And definitely, you want to be a little bit mindful of how you tend to show up in these spaces. So if you're someone who tends to be chatty, maybe try to make some space for other people who are a little bit more quiet. And if you are maybe a little bit more reserved, I know that's me, especially in a group presentation, maybe try to see if you can challenge yourself, push outside of that comfort zone to contribute in chat, or maybe something else you wouldn't normally do in a space like this. And then we also want to talk a little bit about confidentiality. So in trainings like this, one of a saying that's pretty popular is, okay, stories stay, lessons leave. And what that means is if somebody shares a personal story, you don't want to share that outside this space. You never want to say, oh, I was in this training on Sunday and so said this thing was going on, and that's not okay. But if you learn something from what I'm saying, if this changes your perspective, if you get a new insight, that is always okay to share outside this space. You just don't want to say anything that would be somebody else's story that you don't own. And then we also just want to name that we're all committed here to unlearning white supremacy and uplifting voices of people who have been most marginalized, most harmed by these issues. And that's really important to frame the rest of our discussion. Any questions about those points or anything before we move on?
I really appreciated what you said about how people have arrived at the presentation. I've never thought about that, so thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. Okay, one last housekeeping part that I want to go over is talking a little bit about the language that I'm going to be using during this presentation. So first, I just kind of want to talk generally, how do we talk about people who experience sexual violence? How do we talk about people who cause sexual harm, and why do those things matter? So you'll probably notice I use sexual violence as a bit of an umbrella catch-all. That can be anything. I'm really not interested even in labeling experiences, because I know that that is such a personal process. Not everybody feels comfortable identifying as a survivor. Not everybody feels comfortable calling themselves a victim. Not everybody wants to label their experience. That isn't part of everyone's process. Now, I personally call myself a survivor, and that's an important label to me. And so that's the one that I tend to default to, but don't take that to mean that that is a seal of approval for everyone to use that word. Not necessary. And then for people who cause sexual harm, that's usually the preferred way that I talk about that group of people. I don't say perpetrator, I don't say rapist, unless I'm talking about my own lived experience, and that's the word that I choose. And the reason for that is a few. One, I think it's important to recognize the fact that one of the risk factors, one of the known risk factors for causing sexual harm is actually somebody who has experienced sexual violence. And there was a study out of Columbia University, the SHIFT study, that found actually, yeah, most of the people that they identified as causing sexual harm had themselves experienced an assault within the last year. And so we're not always talking about two different groups of people when we're talking about people who cause sexual harm and people who experience it. And in addition to, when we label people outside of the way that people themselves want to be labeled in their own experiences, it alienates people. Not everybody wants to think of somebody that they love as a perpetrator, as a rapist. And adding that additional barrier to, no, you have to call that person that in order to get services, in order to get support, in order to get help, is not fair. And it leaves out people who might still be connected to the person who harmed them and want to maintain that connection, which is a valid way to move forward from sexual violence. And in addition to that point, I just want to talk about some of the terms that we use for campus sexual violence specifically, because they are all kind of intertwined and a little bit hard to pull apart. So one, we have Title IX. That is the civil rights, the federal civil rights law that in theory is supposed to grant equal access to education to all genders. There's also the Title IX reporting process. So if you experience something on your campus that you feel violates your rights under Title IX, you can report that to your school. That might be sexual harassment, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, a bunch of misconduct falls under that line. And when you're reporting to your school, you'll probably be working with someone who's called a Title IX coordinator. That is a position on every campus whose job it is to coordinate the university's response to these issues under Title IX, making sure the university is compliant. And when we're talking about a Title IX case, the words that we use for the people involved are complainant, the person who brought the case, usually the survivor, the person who experienced harm, and then the respondent, the person who caused the sexual harm, the perpetrator, whatever you want to use for that term. Is in Title IX land, it's complainant and respondent. So any questions, or how do we feel about those words? Have you heard that before? Is this new?
I had heard about Title IX, but only in sports. I did not realize that it was a much wider policy per se.
Yeah, it is actually interesting. The original Title IX law that was signed in 1972, it didn't mention sexual violence, it didn't mention sports, but the later court decisions clarified that yes, schools are not allowed to discriminate in those ways, and all of those things constitute sex-based discrimination. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And with the 2020 new regulations, we actually did for the first time get a definition of what is sexual harassment. Of course, that definition was a little bit problematic from an advocate point of view, but it is, it's interesting history how these things have changed. All right. And so before we get started talking a little bit more about the larger issue of campus sexual violence, I did want to spend some time talking about what brought me to this work. And I think this is important, one, so that you understand my perspective, you understand why this is so important to me. And two, I also think that my experience is a really good illustration of what can happen when students aren't supported. And I also, know that from my experience as an advocate, these things are still happening. I went to college a few years ago, but I can't share the stories of people that I work with. What I can share is my own. So I kind of offer my story as a placeholder for all of the survivors that I also know who are going through this. And I try to choose some details that I know are universal to that experience. Now, that being said, everybody's really different. Everybody has their own identities that impact how systems see them, what systems feel safe, if they feel comfortable talking to their school or not. And so, no two experiences are going to be the same. But I do think that the storytelling aspect is important so you can get an idea of what this really feels like when you're in this situation. And so you'll see this picture of me that was taken in 2014. And you might assume, based on the cap and gown, that this was the day that I celebrated my graduation from college. Now, in reality, what happened that day was during my ceremony, I was seated immediately next to the person who had harmed me just over 2 years ago. And in that moment, something inside me broke. That's the best way that I can describe it. This kind of house of cards that I had been building for the last 2 years crumbled. And these identities that I was holding, first generation college student from a low income background who had come to school as a survivor, who then experienced more sexual violence on campus, who did not feel comfortable going to the university and was doing the best to keep herself safe. I did access as much resources on campus as I could, knowing that if I told a professor, if I told an RA, if I told anybody what happened to me, they would have to tell my supervisor at the time, because that was the person who handled the Title IX complaints. And so I accessed resources at the counseling center. I accessed resources at the student health center. I told my friends. I did as much as I could without further harming my own safety or my own privacy. And I was crawling towards graduation with every last ounce of strength that I had. And so on that day, when I found myself seated next to the person who had raped me, I just dissociated. It was everything left that I had to get through that day. And I can't tell you anything else about what happened because I don't remember it. What I do remember is what happened after. And there are a couple papers that I had to turn in after the ceremony. And after that experience, they became these impossible tasks that I could not get done. I tried so hard, I sat down, the words just jumbled on the page. I could not put my research together. And I tried to talk to my professors. Like I said, I told them I'm having a hard time, and they were as lenient with me as they could without the information that they needed to support me. But I decided to just do the next logical step. At that point, I buried my head in the sand. And I had a job at that point. A couple of campus administrators reached out and were like, what happened? You didn't turn these papers in, but I ignored it. And I carried on my way. And it took many, many years for me to unpack the shame of what I felt was a decision I made at that point. I really wasn't seeing it as kind of my last ditch effort to get out of a really bad situation. I really blamed myself for not being able to be successful in school. I didn't know how to ask for help. And it took, about 8 years later, I actually decided to go back. I had to reapply all over again. I had to disclose my trauma in my application because I couldn't think of any other way to explain that, what had happened. And I was accepted back into school. It cost me about $15,000 more than I would have spent. And I'm still paying off that debt, but I got my degree. And that was a really important part of my healing process. And it's not possible for everybody else to go back. I was very helped by a lot of factors. There was some luck. There was a lot of privilege, a lot of people who really helped me along the way. And that's the only reason that I graduated. When I think about the things that students are navigating, especially when you add in students of color, students who are not easily able to prove their citizenship status, students who have disabilities that make it harder for them to show up in learning spaces. There's just so many other identities that can impact things and make it even harder. And so that's been my experience. But I want to pause because I know that that's a lot, especially if you're not used to hearing these stories. And so let's just take a little pause and let's release that. I would actually, recommend if you can stand up and shake it out, take a little bit of a breath and let that go. But yeah, when you're feeling ready, I would love to hear what surprised you about that story. What stood out? What can you imagine other college students, maybe ones that might be facing if they're going to college today?
Lorraine, this is Ruhi. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing your journey with us. It really means a lot. So thank you so much. I'm still breathing. I'm still trying to take it in and release it at the same time. But what stood out for me was that how hard it became for you to do things which you wanted to do. So I've heard people say, if you want to do, if you put all your energy in, you can do it. It's up to you, but it is not that easy. So that is a big takeaway for me, to always realize that and understand that despite of all your desire, your wish, your interest, there are things you could not do. You were not able to turn those tasks in. So that's a thing to remember, and not then expect or die from yourself or others.
Yeah, you never know what anybody's holding. Absolutely. And it's kind of this attitude on campus. It can be hard. I think professors, sometimes maybe are thinking, oh, maybe they're just manipulating me. Maybe they're just trying to get a little leniency. And there's such a maybe hesitancy to just trust people when they say, I am having a hard time. This is what I need. It's almost like this, well, maybe you're not tough enough for this program. Maybe you're not meant to be here. Maybe you can't hack it. When none of those things are true, it's really, and again, student survivors largely are not asking for their degree handed to them on a silver platter, right? We're asking for extensions. We're asking for safety. We're asking to be put in a different class from the person who harmed us. And our schools are saying no. And our schools are not responding to those requests. And that is what makes it hard, right?
I was also, this is Shayla. It struck me how long the impact lasts. We never think about beyond the moment or beyond the 1 year or the 6 months, or we don't really talk about beyond the reporting. Like every story, everything is all about do something about it. And then we don't know what happens or how things play out. And just listening to you that it took 8 years to be able to come back, to start again from where you were, and just the emotional, physical, financial, all kinds of costs to you. Yeah, I mean, that really struck me. And thank you for sharing your story. We really, it definitely drives it home more than statistics.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I was just thinking, Lorraine, that you mentioned that you found yourself sitting next to the person in that moment, to feel that maybe that your journey, it was not acknowledged what you went through, if the person is right there in the same situation as you have, but you had, like I said, we don't judge where the person is coming from, but your journey to that point, and then you find the person right there next to you. It almost feels like what you went through, it's not being acknowledged or recognized. So.
Yeah, no, I had some, it almost tarnishes my degree, a little to think that this person was able to earn the same thing with so much easier. Seemingly, of course. I can't compare my journey to theirs, but in that moment, all I could think of was, this is so unfair. And that's where the floodgate, I think, just burst open, and I could not put the pieces back together in those last few weeks that semester. But yeah, and I want to thank everybody for listening. I know it's hard to stay engaged with us, and it's a lot to take in, but yeah, I think the personal stories are really important. The impacts of it are really important. And I do also like statistics though, so we're going to talk about that as well. So just to illustrate that my experience is not unique, only 35.8% of student survivors complete their programs on schedule. And that's compared to just under 60% nationally. So of course there's other factors in this, right? But if we're just looking at the data, sexual violence in that experience is actually more predictive of how you will do on campus than your standardized test scores in high school, than your grades in high school. All those other factors that we use to measure success in higher education. If you experience sexual violence, your statistic will flip. And in addition, these are all numbers from the Know Your 9 Cost of Reporting survey. So this was a survey that a survivor-led organization called Know Your 9, which is a national organization focused on Title IX and campus sexual violence, sent out the survey for folks to respond who had actually reported to their school. And I pulled a few numbers. If you're interested in this, I would really recommend reading the whole report because it's fascinating. But some of the numbers that really struck me, 70% of survivors who reported to their schools stated that they experienced adverse effects on their safety and on their privacy from reporting. 39% were forced or felt compelled to take an absence of leave, transfer to a new school, or drop out altogether. And 15% of survivors who responded to this survey experienced or were threatened with punishment from their school for coming forward And of those 15%, almost all of them left their programs for various reasons. And the punishment that people can experience, because that sounds a little wild, right? So yeah, those are going to be ancillary misconduct. So let's say you were drinking when you were assaulted, and that's against your school's misconduct policy. You could be punished for that. The survivors' trauma responses are sometimes punished. Speaking out, when your school doesn't do anything and you take to Instagram to name the person who harmed you, you can be punished for that. And that is something that students are navigating every day. And so looking at these numbers, which ones stand out? Any surprises?
Lauren, I'm surprised to see that they're threatened or compelled to either take their report or away or drop out of the school.
Yeah, I've heard of,
Surprising.
yeah, student administrators. I've heard many stories of them even suggesting, pressuring people to take leave of absences, pressuring people not to report violence they experienced to the police. There's a lot of really undue pressure from campus administrators to make these cases go away.
Is there any report they have to show which these numbers, if these reports and these students coming forward makes them look bad? Is that why?
So I think there is a feeling, yeah, that if you're reporting a high number of sexual misconducts, that you are a school with a problem with that. When in reality, when I see somebody reporting 0 sexual misconducts, I get really nervous because I'm thinking, why aren't your students going to you and telling you what's happening? Because we know that this is happening on every campus. And even if you're not experiencing violence, I guarantee that if you spend 4 years in an undergrad institution, you're going to hear about violence that your friends have experienced, people in your Greek organizations, people in your athletic teams, people in your social clubs. This issue impacts everyone. And I know for me personally, one of the big decision-making factors of whether I wanted to tell my school or not was I had heard from my friends who reported to my school. I heard how they were treated. I didn't want to go through that. And so, it takes a lot to come forward. And a lot of the students that I have seen decide to report to their campus are doing so after other efforts have failed, after they've tried to manage the situation interpersonally. They've tried to safety plan and keep themselves safe. Maybe they've reached out to other resources on campus, like I said, the counseling center, if they have a confidential advocate. The students who are reporting are often just trying this last-ditch effort to get the help that they need to stay safe on campus. And unfortunately, you can see from these numbers, that is not always successful.
Lauren, how much are parents involved in all this reporting?
Yeah, so I will say it is a big concern for students that I support who are thinking about reporting. A lot of them will ask me, will my parents find out? And most of the time, if you don't want your parents to find out, you can probably keep it from them. But these cases also absorb a lot of your time. It's not just you report to your school and they handle it from there. You're spending hours talking to the Title IX investigators. You are turning over any evidence that you have to support your claim. These cases can typically take about a year if they go to a hearing. So you're dealing with this for a long time. And there's a few different outcomes. I mean, you can also go to your school and ask them for what are called supportive measures. And you don't have to tell them who hurt you or anything like that if you don't want to go through the full reporting process. And your school is obligated to give you some supportive measures on campus. Now, these are not able to do anything that unreasonably burden the other person. So you can often ask to change your classes, change your dorm, but you can't ask the other person to change if you don't want to go through the whole reporting process. But yeah, in terms of the rules of family, it really does vary. And that's where when we get into our discussion piece, I want to talk more about why don't students involve their families? What messages are students being sent to college with from their families, from their communities, that make it harder to reach out? And yeah, we'll talk about that next. So that's a good segue. Any other reactions or questions, or yeah, just things coming up when you look at these numbers? Oh, I see in the chat, are there any peer support groups on campus, or one can go to for help? Yeah, so there are often resources on campus. And that's actually one of my general recommendations for safety planning. Before anybody gets to college, look up what those confidential resources are. Is there a women's center? Is there a confidential advocate? Is there a counseling center? And if so, what services do they offer? And I will say with college, it is actually a pretty well-resourced time for a lot of people, right? You have access to a lot of services, a lot of support that is pretty unique. And I will say, I think, my support group on my campus was the thing that saved me, really. That community, that support, that help really was a touchstone of my college experience. I'm still in touch with, people I met through that. So some schools do offer programming and services. It really is very like campus by campus dependent.
Noreen, to that point, you said that every campus has to have a Title IX coordinator. So that's from the campus side. They're not a direct resource for the students. They are who kind of manage it from a policy perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really good question, because oftentimes when you're Googling resources on your campus, the Title IX office is going to be the first thing that comes up. But what is really important to know is that anything that you disclose to Title IX may be used to initiate an investigation. And that is with or without your consent, depending on the circumstance. So if you go to your school and maybe you say, hey, this thing happened, I'm not really sure what I want to do about it, and your school decides that there is a campus safety issue, they might say, well, that's not your decision. We have to investigate this for the larger campus safety. And if they do that, they will use everything at their disposal to get information about who harmed you, witnesses they can call, and they can use basically academics to compel you. They might hold your transcripts if you refuse to cooperate. They might not let you register for classes if you refuse to cooperate with their investigation. So those are tools that schools use to leverage information. And yeah, so when you're talking to a Title IX coordinator, you want to be aware of that. And if you are sharing information with them, you always want to assume that if there is a Title IX case, any information you share with them will be shared with the other party. So if you're presenting journal entries, if you're presenting photographs, if you're presenting private text messages or conversations, just know that that is going to likely be in front of the person that you're complaining about's eyes, and they'll have a chance to review that.
Thank you.
Any other questions about that?
So just so I'm clear, what we are hearing is that going to Title IX, and that is like formal reporting. And that is something that we do after we understand the implications of having once formally reported what may happen. But then there are other community related support that one could take as a support group, or the counselors that are not the same. So
Yep.
It's a question of what fits our needs and what we're wanting to do. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I encourage, if anybody finds themselves navigating this situation for themselves or for a friend or for a loved one, an advocate, a confidential advocate, to explain what are the options on campus? What kind of administration works here? How have cases gone in the past? What resources are in the community if you don't want a campus solution? And can we get an advocate to help you with those things? That's a really crucial wheelhouse of information and knowledge and support. So if your campus has a confidential advocate, and every UC campus should have one, there's different systems have different policies. But yeah, so a lot of schools will have a campus advocate, but if not, then the other confidential option I would recommend is the counseling center, because that will have, counselors who do not have to disclose who may not be experts in sexual violence, but will hopefully be trauma informed and knowledgeable about the resources on campus. But yeah, unfortunately, you really can't disclose anything to professors, RAs, staff, anything like that are likely going to be mandated to report any violence that they know about to the Title IX office.
I had one more question or thought, and it might be on your slides. You mentioned women's centers. The moment you said women's center, I was thinking about the boys and gender. So I'm assuming these numbers include all genders, right? This is just violence on campuses. Are we at a point where resources are being extended in campuses to include all genders, or do we still see ourselves leaning a lot more towards women and girls?
Yeah, I would say that it's changing. I think it's honestly even a little bit more welcoming, because there's often like LGBT services and things like that on campus too. But still, getting support as a male survivor of sexual assault anywhere is going to be really hard. And on college campuses specifically, one of the really interesting things to know is that this 18 to 24-year-old age group, right, is highly at risk for sexual assault across the populations, college or not college. But college is actually slightly protective for that age group. So there's a slightly lower rate of sexual assault for those enrolled in college versus not. The only exception for that is men. Men enrolled in college have a slightly higher rate of sexual assault than men who aren't. And I'm sure that there are sociologists who have really interesting theories about why that is. My kind of gut reaction is like, a lot of power dynamics on campus are really reinforced. A lot of white male supremacy is perpetuated by athletics, by Greek life, by how campuses are structured. So the violence that men experience is real, is happening, and is even less likely to be talked about.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah. But now, with these last, I want to save 20, 30 minutes at the end for Q&A, but I would love to get a little bit more into a discussion about what changes would actually need to be made, right? Because I've described a little bit about what the current situation is like. And what would it look like if we had communities that respect, inform, and protect their young people, who really prepared their young people for the experiences that they are going to face in college? And what would it look like on campus if our campuses welcomed survivors' experiences? What if it was okay to say, your first day of orientation, hey, I had this happen when I was a child. I don't know how I'm going to feel adjusting to college. I don't know how I'm going to keep myself safe. I don't know how I'm going to navigate these sexual situations where I don't even understand what I want sexually and my body freezes up because that's a trauma response I learned from childhood. There's a lot of things that we could do to show up for survivors on campus. And that doesn't mean expelling anybody who gets accused of sexual violence. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real, meaningful support. For me personally, the thing that really would have done it is if I could go to my college and say, look, my friend really hurt me, and I think he might hurt other people. Can someone talk to him and explain why this was wrong? Can someone help him understand consent? And then we're good. That is all I really wanted. I wanted someone to intervene so I didn't feel responsible if he hurt somebody else. And I wanted some support on my academics so that I could recover and reach my goals and still heal. So I would love to take a little bit of time and just talk about what other things could we imagine for how we're raising our kids, how we're sending them to school, and how we're expecting them to exist when they're in college. Does anyone have any thoughts from what I've said so far?
I think as a parent, the first thing is to be aware that these things happen for a parent and for the child who's going to be in the college, right?
Yeah.
We are sometimes in denial and in denial that it might happen to our kids. That's the second level of denial. So that's the first thing we need to be as a takeaway, that these things are real, these happen. And to your point, what you said, that if some college is saying that we have zero sexual violation reports, that means something is fishy and something is wrong.
Yeah. I will say it's interesting. I can't tell you the number of times I have talked to somebody who got to college, took the mandatory, maybe online couple-hour video that you have to take about sexual violence, and was suddenly able to put words to experiences that they never knew were violations. And then what do you do with that new information? And so, yeah, definitely having that information, talking about it. What does it actually look like? Because I think we have this idea of what sexual violence looks like, right? We have this sort of mythology of, especially on campus, right? We like to talk about like this drunken frat house situation, which is very reflective of white students' experiences in college. It is not reflective of everybody's experiences in college. And so what does it look like for your student? The person that you love navigating this landscape, what are the risk factors for them? It's really important to talk about those things with your child.
My kids are really young right now. They're nowhere close to college. But when I thought about communities that respect, I'm just thinking I will not be speaking with them specifically about these situations at this age. They're very young, but to generally create an atmosphere of, I'm not sure I would say trauma exists, but that all experiences are welcome in our conversations, and that we are here as a support. And I'm surrounded by a lot of folks who, friends and aunts and uncles who think similarly. So it's like a small community that kind of hopefully is promoting a space where whatever your experience is, somebody is here to hear it out. And not just as somebody who will experience an assault, but maybe we are able to create a space of prevention for anybody who might become the person who will cause the harm.
Exactly.
So at this point, that's kind of the first thing. I don't know much about colleges. I don't know much about high school and middle school, but from where we sit, I think that's kind of where we are coming from. Everything I hear, I take back to what kind of experience am I, or a space am I creating for my children when they want to talk about anything that they experience.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point too, because it doesn't even have to be about violence, right? Like what does your child believe will happen if they're having a hard time in school? Real or imagined? Because sometimes I think we assume the worst of what our parents' responses are going to be. But yeah, what does your child know about how you'll handle that if they're having a hard time for any reason?
I'll just add to that. I'm sorry, since everybody's quiet, I'll just jump in. That I think, but we are already with an 8-year-old, I think we started at 4 or 5 about your space and your body. And that's something, I don't know whether we started too early, but I know my 4-year-old is also about my body and my space. And I don't know, just a thought that when I was thinking about this kind of violence, like that's kind of where we come from, that your space and the person in front of you, both the spaces are equally important.
Yes, yeah. And that age-based, appropriate consent education from the minute that you can start talking about that is so crucial. And I love that point that you just made too about how are you imagining the people that you're having sex with when you go to college? Are you imagining them as full human beings, or are you imagining them as kind of part of your college experience, that they're just characters here? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you think of other people, when you think of other people that way, if you think about your sexual experiences that way, it's really risky, not just because you end up following these sexual scripts without actually thinking about what you want and what the other person wants. But yeah, you can just kind of end up in situations where things happen and then you have to label it, and it's a lot. Yeah. Oh, and I see a question in the chat. Is anything being done to introduce a college prep course during senior year in high school? We have a sex ed class. Can a sexual assault course be offered too? I would love that on every single high school should be educating students about these things. And that's one of the big problems is the patchwork sex education that we have in this country. Some schools are really well funded and they have great programming, and no students are being held back from that programming by parents who don't want them to have access to that information. That's the best case scenario. But a lot of sex ed is very anatomically based. It's like how to put a condom on, what's an STD. They're not talking about sexual violence. And if they are, they're talking about that within cis straight relationships. They're not talking about what does this look like if you're sleeping with somebody who's your same gender? What does this look like if you're sleeping with multiple people? And that conversation might be a little bit too much for high school, but those are the situations that you're navigating sometimes in college. So what is the risk of sending them off without that information?
I also want to say that this is Shayla, that along with all this, there is this whole emotional component to having a relationship and then having your trust broken in a relationship. And that's never talked about. And it's not taken seriously by parents or the messaging that we give, because we don't take those relationships seriously. They're young, they'll get over it. Or this is the time you should have been focused on studies, and then why is this happening? I'm speaking a little bit with my cultural background as well. And that's really, it just adds layers and layers to your relationship not being taken seriously. It adds to the shame and the guilt. It adds to the silence that a survivor may experience. So I feel like for us parents to really think about how do we evolve, how we see our children as they grow older in terms of their decision making, their relationships, and really not trivialize emotions. Because I think at the end of it, it all starts with us not thinking some emotions are important enough for us to pause and reflect on. And that's something that we've learned too. So having the self-compassion of knowing that it comes from a place of us also being part of what we've learned. But just as you were talking, I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. It's a really good point. Yeah, anything else? Oh, I think I heard someone unmute.
Yeah, it's it's me, Lorraine. You were talking about that on the campus, people or students can come and share with for the support groups or people who have some ideas on how to deal with it by yourself without you going to report. So, it's any trainings or any material is available with those folks um, on understanding what even before, I think even before somebody comes and reports to the campus students, right? Is there anything which they can provide or a training for the students before the fact to understand more about what harassment looks like, what violence looks like, what are the simple signs of somebody trying to harass you or has different intent behind their actions? Those material, is that anywhere available for students?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So I know that most campuses, especially in California, are going to have a mandatory training that every student every year is going to have to take about these topics. And now, right, like people don't really pay attention to things that aren't relevant to them. So that's a little bit hit or miss. If you need that information, it'll find you. But if you're only hearing it for the first time during orientation, when you're hearing everything else that you need to know about being a college student, you might absorb it, you might not. And yeah, I would say, there are some like national organizations that I can highlight. I know I mentioned Know Your Nine. There is also End Rape on Campus, which has good information on their website, just like that anybody would benefit from. But yeah, the situation campus to campus is very different. I know a lot of schools will have like peer educators. That was something I did when I was in college. That was really great. But you are like trained to do presentations to other students on consent, on healthy relationships, on stalking, on prevention, things like that. So they do exist, and people are definitely doing this work. And a lot of really passionate preventionists are working on these issues all the time. But it's a lot of ground that we have to cover before we're anywhere close to where we need to be. All right. Yeah. Any other things that you can imagine that you wish were different, either about our communities or about our schools?
I think we have to remove the stigma. As soon as we remove the stigma of um, these conversations or these things happening anywhere, campus, no campus, wherever, we label it so quickly. We as in any, I'm talking about communities and societies. I think we have to just remove the stigma, and that stigma, when it is removed even from the colleges, to say, I'm okay to say that our college had 50% of this or X number of reports, and these are the measures we have taken, and this is how we are declining it. We have to start somewhere accepting that that's a good thing rather than a bad thing. And I
Yeah.
don't know what parents in this can do to make colleges comfortable to say this is not really a ding on you, but this is really something which can help you grow, and parents and kids feeling more comfortable to come to your college. Don't know how to do that, but I think that is what is required.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned parents in that, right? Because what do schools care about? They care about their matriculation rates, they care about their reputations, they care about who's paying that tuition money. And if you have leverage in any of those areas, which I would say parents of college students have a lot of leverage, yeah, that is a power that you have to influence your school. And that gets a little bit more into like, what does grassroots organizing look like? Are there other parents that feel similarly? Are there students who are already doing this work on campus? One of the tricky things about change making on campuses is that there's this turnover every 4 years where all that historical knowledge from activists on campus graduate. And maybe there's a network, maybe there's not. Some schools there are, but often it's kind of people reinventing the wheel on let's do some change making. Let's make them take this seriously every 4 years. So yeah, parental support, community support for student organizing is so crucial to make that actually sustainable and enact change.
Lorraine, I have a similar question for students then, because I think we have a couple of youth here as well. What could youth be doing in terms of how they respond, or what they could empower themselves to do in a situation where they're either helping someone or they have a lived experience themselves? Any ideas around that? What we could help them reimagine or share with their friends?
Yeah, so I would say it's going to sound a little heavy, but I'm going to bring it back up. I would say start with the assumption that you are working in a broken system. Do not expect positive results from your school. Do not expect positive results from your community, and know that you're going up against these barriers when you're making your decisions, right? And so that, like, holding that narrative of this is going to be really hard. And I'm trying to, this is, okay. My brain is working and I'm losing my thoughts a little bit because this is a really good question. Yeah, I would bring it back to the shame and the stigma, because your college and the way our society works is going to try to make you feel like you don't belong if you are having a hard time. They're going to try to make you feel like you're a problem, like you did something wrong. And if you can decide, no matter what I experience, I deserve a college education. I deserve to reach my dreams. I deserve respect, support, care. And I didn't do anything to be ashamed of, even if they try to make me feel that way. And I know from experience that is easier said than done. But if you are not finding the people who are supporting you and who are seeing your pain, validating your pain, doing what they can to support you in what you're going through, keep reaching out, because that doesn't mean that you don't deserve that support. That just means you haven't found it yet. And, I think about, because like that is all happening while you're trying to be a student. And yeah, and just know that, like friends are great, but they're also not often equipped to hold that much. There's such a burden on college students holding their friends' trauma. And they don't have the training for that. They don't have, a way to unpack that. So if you can find it in yourself to reach out to a confidential advocate, maybe a hotline, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, RAINN, they have an online chat that you can go on. You don't even have to talk, but just anything that you can get that support, because you deserve it. And yeah, that would be kind of my messaging for students.
Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful. I love the message you've given of not absorbing the external messages, because systems can be hard, but that doesn't mean that we don't deserve the help. And I feel like what you really just touched upon, because we know that friends in that age, I mean, we were all college going students at some point in some era. We do hold a lot of secrets. So I think even encouraging a friend who may be sharing with you to reach for formal resources, which may not be perhaps the school system, but the hotline you're talking about at the chat. So you're safer, and hopefully if families are being more supportive, having more, because at least, I mean, I'm putting on my counselor hat a little bit and saying every time there's support from families and friends, or there's a professional support from like an advocate like you, it makes a difference. It makes a difference to how the experience is understood and how well or how quickly somebody even starts the journey. I'm not saying healing happens, but at least you start the journey with more well-resourced than if you were trying to do it alone or with a friend who's perhaps as young as you are or struggling to hold the space for you,
Yeah.
but has a lot of love for you.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. It's just so hard to offer perspective that you don't have, right? Like I can tell a college student who is considering taking a leave of absence, which is, such a big decision. Yeah, like maybe this isn't the right time to be in school, but you know what? I went back. You can go back, and like encouraging them in that way. And this isn't the end of the world. This isn't the end of your journey if you're not successful in this program. Of course, I'm going to do everything that I can to support whatever you want to do. But yeah, there is a reality where sometimes people aren't able to meet their goals, and normalizing that and making it okay. And removing the stigma from whatever you need to do as a survivor, right? Like there are no bad decisions. Whatever you need to do to make it through the day, keep yourself as safe as possible. You're doing it. That's all you're doing.
beautiful. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to, unless there are any other questions or reflections, I'm actually going to ask to turn the recording off and we can just open it up to some general Q&A. But let me actually put up my email first before we do that. So that's, and the hotline number.
Do you want to read out your hotline number before I turn the recording off?
Yeah, just give me 1 second. I'll go to my slide that has my information.
Wonderful.
Awesome. So yeah, this is our BAWAR hotline. If you've called us before, you'll notice that we have a different number right now. We're having some technical issues with our phone number. So you can reach us at 510-345-1056. And my email is right there.
Thank you. And I'm still